Today's episode is sponsored by Anchor. My cousin recommended this app to me, and I thought this was an app about boats or anchors for sale or something, but Anchor is a completely free and easy way to start your own podcast. All of the tools are laid out for you from recording to editing to even adding voice messages from listeners. You can also podcast from your phone or computer. Wait, there's more. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it could be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more services. No tedious individual uploading and sharing. And the best part, you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. That is the free Anchor app, or go to anchor.fm. Hello, everyone. My name is Frank Anthony, and welcome to Let Me Be Frank. Today's topic is trauma. And for anyone out there that's not exactly sure on the definition of trauma, according to the Center of Excellence for Integrated Health Solutions, trauma refers to intense and overwhelming experiences that involve serious loss, threat, or harm to a person's physical and or emotional well-being. And today we have non-toxic living expert and trauma coach, Toni Pakus. Say hello, Toni.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being on today.
My pleasure.
Awesome. So one thing I was curious about is what made you want to get into crisis counseling?
So I think when we're growing up, some of us dream about being astronauts or firefighters. I always wanted to be I always thought being a microbiologist, not my marine biologist. Okay. So I thought that meant I would work with dolphins. So that was what I wanted to be when I grew up as a little kid. And then as I was growing up, I saw so much pain around me and didn't even realize what was happening to me in the midst of it. But it came out of survival and a need to better myself, and realize that it really came full circle when Sandy Hook happened. And I am not politically driven or anything like that, but that was just the moment. I was in school for psychology and Christian counseling, and Sandy Hook happened, and I had realized how much my children had endured in just the short years of their life. And I realized how much trauma had really just impacted my personality and character. And I think it was at that point that I decided this is not going to change. It was kind of like that moment where you realize a fork has just come in the road, has just come before you, and you don't even think, you just go. And so I kind of literally got on the phone, changed my degree path. And after that, it took me many years to get my degree, because while I was in the process, I dealt with some of my own trauma. So a lot of what I've come to know is out of personal healing and a mission to really serve others and help educate people.
That's awesome. I mean, yeah, that's definitely, I know when I was younger too, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And I know going through college, I didn't necessarily go through that myself at first. I ended up changing my college major as well, and finally was on that track of this is what I want to do.
Right. It's not always clear. That's okay. We always figure it out.
Definitely. And you had sent me one of your live videos before doing this recording.
Mm-hmm.
And one point that you made that stood out to me the most was that you're talking about that we have different types of brains. And I've heard in the past about people having the left or right brain, but you had talked about us having a trauma brain. And I want to know what you meant by that to explain to everyone.
So when you're speaking left right brain, that's the hemispheres of the brain, and each section of the brain, and that was something that I fell in love with throughout my training, was the magnificence of the brain's capacity to truly work on our behalf without us even knowing. So you have a left and right hemisphere of your brain, and then you have the frontal lobe, and you have all of your different brain parts, and each serves a function. When I say trauma brain, I was referring to also diaper brain. So they say, when you are first having children, and I remember my mom used to say, I have diaper brain, cut me some slack. It was because she was having sleepless nights, and she was, it was just kind of like a name she gave it. But there actually is truly, what I had come to learn is what they call trauma brain, and it's your brain's response to trauma, and you're functioning out of that. It's kind of like your brain is now functioning in trauma mode all the time. So I was also talking about chemo brain, and when people are, the chemo affects your brain in such a way that it changes your brain's chemistry. And that's what I mean when I say trauma brain. And it's not my term, it's actually a term I came across in my studies.
Oh.
And it's really just a way that you're no longer functioning out of your brain as a whole. Your brain has rewired itself to function based on trauma. And that can be your length of time spent in fight, flight, or freeze mode. So when your amygdala is fired up, and that's just a portion of the brain, it's a tiny little portion of the brain. And that's where your fight, flight, or freeze response happens. And when that fires up, your prefrontal cortex is where your rational thinking and your logical thinking all happen. And that shuts down because now it's your brain's response to a situation that is deemed life threatening, or, they used to just say fight or flight, but it's actually fight, flight, or freeze, which is why a lot of people who are abused don't do anything about their abuse, because they're frozen when it happens. And so that's kind of what I mean when I say trauma brain. You're not functioning out of a normally firing, your brain is not firing in its normal capacity, in the way that it was meant to be. So I have learned over the years how to heal that. And it's still not 100% for myself, but I do understand certain things about trauma now that I never knew before. And it's not just your brain, your whole body has history of trauma. And I have some resources I could point you to on that. But it's a fascinating topic. And I know you have some questions for me, but looking over some of those questions, I could understand why those are some of the questions that you got. And it fascinates me because it is such a little known topic, right? We think you have to be a combat soldier, or you have to have faced a refugee camp in Syria, or a natural disaster. And really, that's not all it's about. It can be something simple.
And that's exactly why. I mean, you obviously made a lot of great points. That's exactly why I wanted to start this show, because I wanted to have these open, honest conversations on various topics that we either don't really hear about or we think we know about, but there's even more to uncover with
Right.
those. And just a couple topics we've had so far, I feel like I've already learned a little bit more than I already did. And I know I'm already learning from this one as well. And I know there's people out there that can benefit from this information. So it's great to, have these types of conversations.
Yeah, I love that you're doing this. And it's not a one stop shop. It's not a one conversation thing. You're not going to hear
Yeah.
one discussion on it and be like, oh wow, I know everything I need to know now. It's kind of like, this is the intro,
Yep.
and I would love to expand on it more. It's truly what I'm passionate about. and why I got my degree in crisis counseling. It's not about becoming a counselor for people. That's why I call myself a trauma coach. There's a time and a place for someone to come alongside you, which is what a coach is, versus someone needing to, there's trauma therapists that are highly skilled, highly educated, and, they are some of the people I learn from, but I'm not sure that I'm the one that could really get somebody that next level. I'm more of that come alongside. I truly know how you're feeling, even if it's a different situation, because my entire body has experienced trauma at one point or another. And you need to have the experience to be able to relate to people and really be able to look them in the eye and say, I really do understand you.
Yes, I agree with that. And I know the next question that we're going to go over is, and whatever we're comfortable sharing is perfectly fine. It's types of trauma that we have experienced. And my couple of examples, I say I don't know because maybe I just suppressed it. I just never really acknowledged anything I've gone through necessarily as trauma
Hmm.
because of I feel like PTSD was brought up so much, even though there's way more to trauma than
Right.
just PTSD. So I was always thinking to myself, oh, well, like, it couldn't, like, I don't think I went through anything as bad as other people went through, but in reality, it was still something traumatic I had gone through, and I just maybe didn't place as much importance on it as I should
Right.
have.
And I don't have my questions in front of me. So if you want to read me the question, I did look them over, but I don't like to kind of script things. So I,
Yeah, no, of course. It was, what type of trauma have you experienced?
okay. So I think this helps a lot of people understand that there are different levels of trauma. And just because you have a traumatic experience, it doesn't mean that my traumatic experience is, you know, it's the same thing with, so I personally had been molested as a child. And for years, decades, I thought that's the only issue. Like that was my only trauma. Um, it's one thing when you are abused by somebody, but it's another thing when you're abused by somebody that you can't get away from. And so I thought that was it. I thought that was the only trauma. I thought, you know, that was the only thing I had to resolve. And when I get that dealt with, everything else will be fine. The funny thing about trauma is you don't have to remember it, your body will. And so there's this amazing book called The Body Keeps the Score: Brain, Mind, and Body and the Healing of Trauma. And it's by Bessel van der Kolk, an amazing expert on trauma and the brain. And so one of the things that was happening to me is that as my children were growing and getting to certain ages that I had been traumatized, I would have a childlike response. So I would re- literally, so I was diagnosed with PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, and dissociative identity disorder in 2005. And this was 2 years into therapy. And it was I think my therapist had told me, but I didn't like click. I didn't accept it or whatever. Or maybe I didn't understand what she was talking about. I was fascinated by the movie Sybil when I was a kid. And
Okay.
so I thought for multiple personality disorder, you had to have the block time. You had to have this, I call myself by different names. And that's not dissociative identity disorder. Dissociation is when your brain protects you from what's going on. And it can be as simple as I don't have memories from a certain point in my childhood because my brain blocked it from me. That doesn't mean my body doesn't remember. So I'm sorry, I get a little winded when I start to talk about it because even though I've dealt with trauma, it's still a huge burden. So I would maybe smell like this was back in 2013. So deep into my therapy and my education, I would smell cigarettes while I was sleeping in my bed. And I thought for sure I had a guy, I was living in an apartment. I swore I had somebody living upstairs from me that was smoking all the time, or somebody standing outside my window smoking. And it wasn't. It was a phantom smell, and it was a trauma trigger, and something in my brain was having a memory that I had no tie to. And I still to this day don't know what it is, but there's certain scents that I smell, I get irritated, it's just a trigger for me. So there's also cyclical things that happen. And so you may not remember certain things that happen, but your brain and your body seasons, it could be a song on the radio and you don't really know that it affects you, but all of a sudden you can get irritable or
Yeah.
mood changes. And so for me, my boyfriend would tell me, and even my family, what just happened, it would almost be like a bipolar change where I could just get set off for no reason. And I would say, what are you talking about? I'm fine, because I didn't recognize my demeanor had changed. My expressions had changed. I would go from being an adult talking to you right now like this to acting like a 14-year-old child. Or transitioning into a conversation with the kids or my son and his friends at 12 years old and acting like I was one of them. These are all things I didn't understand were happening to me, but somebody on the outside could see. And so I've learned over time that I didn't have control over it. My brain just kind of switched gears in a way. And once I could understand that it was a trauma response, I could then step back and realize, oh, wow, this is really happening. And what is the trigger? And then working on it in therapy and journaling. And people who have known me over the years have seen a complete difference in who I am today and how I act in certain situations. And I still get triggered. I still, last August, realized one of my first traumas was when my dad left when I was 3 years old. And I did not know abandonment was such a trauma. But when you are that connected to another human being and they are no longer part of your life, this is where death comes in. It was like a death. So my little 3-year-old brain couldn't process this person that was part of my life every day was no longer around, and no one could explain it to me. And, I still to this day don't have that all figured out, because it's really a new revelation if you think about it. Kind of realized it in September, October, that I have cyclical, seasonal triggers, and sometimes I feel them and sometimes I don't, and sometimes they're heavier than others, and sometimes I'm like, oh yeah, this is a season, I got to figure it out or just make my way through it. And so I think that helps people when they realize that, mood swings or, depression, even anxieties, it's not all trauma related, but if it is trauma related, there's a different way to deal with it than, for me, popping a pill works for my depression, but does not work for my anxiety.
Yes.
I wish it did.
I know, a one pill, one shot.
Oh, wait, I'm feeling anxious. Let me take that. No, because all that does is put me to sleep. It doesn't help me process the anxiety or the issue that's causing the anxiety. So it's a lifelong process. I can't tell you, Frank, that I will know when this is better. I could be great one day, and then at 6 o'clock at night, sitting on the couch, all of a sudden I want to rip somebody's head off. And why? Is it a commercial that was just on? Did Tom do something to set me off that the poor guy didn't do anything? And he looks at me like, what just happened? You were just fine 2 seconds ago. And I mean that in a way like you just shut down and withdraw. Like all of a sudden my happy-go-lucky self isn't the same. And you just have to be graceful with yourself, have mercy with yourself, and go, I recognize this is something that I can't identify right now. And I don't always need the answer as to what the trauma was. That was one thing I've learned. I know you didn't ask that question, but you don't always, I always thought you have to identify it all. I have to know what happened to me when I was 4 years old. I have flashbacks of certain things, but I don't have to know. I know something happened and I know I'm okay. I made it out alive. I have two amazing children. I'm successful in my business. People love me, and that sounds self. I don't know. I don't even know the word for it. It sounds like I'm bragging on myself, but to be honest with you, those are things I have to write in my journal because I don't believe them about myself. So that's another thing about trauma is you believe the lies in your head and they run rampant, and you have to get control of them because no one would ever, if you wouldn't say it to your child, then don't say it to yourself. Don't tell yourself every day, oh, I suck. I should just, whatever. That's not the way to handle it. So it's a lot of work, my friend, a lot of work, but so worth it because then I can help other people by helping them identify those things. So
Yeah, I mean, definitely, you definitely shared good pieces of advice that I can take with me
good.
too. And I am truly sorry what you've had to go through, but I'm also thankful that you have been working so hard with it and now you're helping other people. I mean, this is, yeah, you're definitely, I'm happy this was also your dream as well because
Yeah. I think when we realize that, you know, the crappy stuff, it can make or break us. And if we let it make us, because really that's, I mean, I don't know if your audience is what their faith is, but mine, part of the reason that I am able to stand on 2 feet today is because of my faith. And if if God allowed those things to happen to me, he did them for good reason. And I can't say that everyone will ever believe that. If you have the death of a child, that's a traumatic thing. I have also lost a child. So but I also believe that I was not in the right state of mind if that child was born, that it would have been um, given the life my other children had. So I felt like everything that has ever happened to me happened for good reason. I have an amazing family, even in spite of the abuse I've endured. Um, and I may not have always dealt with things properly in my own eyes and how I would have wanted to, but because I wasn't functioning in a full understanding of why I was functioning that way, it's kind of like an alcoholic or somebody who uses substances. You don't choose it, um, but how you deal with it and how you come out of it. I truly feel like blessed that I endured years of the word, kind of like self-affliction, where I mean I never suffered with addiction. That is a blessing. um, but I always was self-deprecating, and um, I probably missed out on some opportunities because of it, but those opportunities didn't pass me by. They just got put on hold. And, hopefully I didn't miss out too much with my kids, and hopefully they learned from me. But, we can't look at our past and blame it for, I can't blame my mom or anybody in my life that things happened to me because she also endured trauma. She also endured pain. And for me to say, you were a bad mom or you didn't protect me, she did the best she could and she had no idea what was happening. If she did, she would have never let it happen. We know better. When we know better, we do better. We always say that, right, Frank?
yep.
Um, and that's why it's so important to do what we're doing right now. And I appreciate that this is your journey, and that even though we connected in another way, that you're still my brother from another mother. And however I can support you on your path, that's what I'm here for. So
I say you can connect with the same people in multiple different ways.
yeah, if you're meant to be connected, you will stay connected.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
I think before I get into any of my own stuff, I think it's a good time to take a quick commercial break. So we will be right back. All right, and we are back. Welcome back to Let Me Be Frank. Toni had just shared so much with us about personal experience and really good advice on how to look at life too, which I appreciate a lot. Um, with with my own experiences, so Toni, you mentioned your father, and I actually a tr- that was something that I have a similar experience with as well that I didn't even think about as listing as a trauma on this episode originally.
Hmm.
My father was gone. There's a long story with it all, but an
There always
abridged
is,
version.
isn't there?
There is, but there's a lot more secrets to the story and everything.
Yeah.
But the abridged version was that while my mother was pregnant with me, he was gone,
Mm-hmm.
and we tried to reconnect. Probably I want to say I was 16, 17,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't good, honestly. Like I wish it was better. I just think I mean, I'm a way different person now than I am at that time. I wasn't really a great person, and I don't it just yeah, there was definitely a disconnect. I think we were both trying to, since we didn't really know each other, we were trying to do what we thought the other one wouldn't mind or anything. We were just on very different pages, pretty much.
I
So
totally
there,
relate. Similar
so yeah,
situation. Yeah.
yeah, there was just no. It was like, okay, maybe it's just too late. Like we're not connecting.
Mhm.
But what I do notice is that I'm not good with other. I realize because of this experience, I'm not good with other people's fathers. I noticed. I never know what to talk about with them. Um, I never like I notice with like moms and stuff. I don't know. It's weird. I can come up with something, but I don't know. Maybe because I was a Pure Haven consultant. I don't know.
You
Maybe
know,
it's just
funny
easy.
as you speak that, um, you know, I had a similar issue. I wanted my dad so much that I thought, this guy must have just not been able to get to me or he would have been in my life. Like there was no way that he abandoned me. Like it must have just been that, my mom was such a horrible person that he couldn't be with me. What I've realized is he left for a reason. And every time I tried to reconnect, I wanted him to be something he was not.
Mm,
And even to this day, I know he cannot be that something. And then I look at the fact that, because I've always struggled with daddy problems, I always wanted to be a daddy's girl. And so I don't have a lot of, I have uncles in my life and stuff like that, but I can totally relate to you on, you don't know what to say with somebody else's dad because you didn't have that it almost gives you either one way or the other. You either say too much and you have unhealthy relationships with other dads, like your friends' dads, or as a girl, not meaning in a crossing boundaries way,
yeah,
but just like, you're looking for, you see somebody who has a great relationship with her dad and you're like, there must be something wrong with that. And then, you know, I don't know. I'm totally going off track there, but I totally relate to you because you think it's in a way your fault. Um, and so you probably put yourself on guard when you try to have conversations with other people's dads. But dude, you're one of the best people I know. So you should never not know what to say to somebody. I just want to give you that, like, just be you. All you gotta
thank you.
do.
And you're amazing.
No, this is just the Toni and Frank show right now.
um,
Anyway,
to
next.
fin yeah, to finish off that little point was I think what bothered me the most with not really having a father figure was, and it wasn't even like, oh, other people and their dads and where's mine. It wasn't even so much that. It's that I had half siblings. I have half siblings. I have three of them,
Yeah.
And I never even met one of them either to this day,
Wow.
unfortunately. But, and I've only met one of them in person. But what bothered me was that all three of them had him.
Right.
They they knew him. He was at weddings and such, and like they got the father experience. And maybe it wasn't the best, maybe it wasn't the worst, but they had it. And I had Easter gifts that I thought I was getting from my father every year, and then my mom told me it was her this whole time. So like that's the closest I ever. So that's what sucked
Yeah.
about it. And that's something looking that I can look back now and be and think, oh, like I guess that does make a little bit more sense. I don't know if I would identify it as trauma in my case, but I mean maybe there is a little bit, but
Well, and I think that's the thing is not everyone experiences trauma. Um, some people have very healthy brain systems, and maybe you didn't suffer the trauma of him being gone. It just you didn't have some of the experiences that you would have had. So it doesn't necessarily, I want to say this in two ways. It doesn't negate the fact that you could have had a traumatic experience just because someone else might not look at it as trauma, or think of it in a way that could be traumatic. But grief and loss is traumatic as a traumatic thing, depending on what you have for supports around you. And if you have a nurturing parent in the absence of another parent, it can be very fulfilling. You're not missing anything. You may be missing those little arrearages or rearings that um, many people go through and help guide them to be, I don't know, have experiences that maybe would have been beneficial, but you're not necessarily missing out on anything. You could be feeling that you're missing out because you have siblings that had him, um, and but that also doesn't mean somebody that experienced, you know, 9/11, they may have had immediate trauma, but then their trauma was resolved and they don't have the, um, reoccurring uh, traumatic responses. The thing that can really impact your level of effect on trauma is reoccurring instances of trauma. So if you were, let's say you had a car accident and one of your, I don't know, something happened, and then you had 5 years later a death in the family, or then you had, experienced a natural disaster, and then, if you have things happen over and over and things that aren't dealt with, that can also impact your level of trauma. So if you have one little thing that happens, you deal with it, it resolves. You may not have, an issue in your life. But if you have things that happen over and over again, your brain doesn't have time to heal from it, doesn't have time to, um, it kind of builds up on that traumatic response. And again, the trauma brain. Your brain automatically recognizes it as trauma. One other side note on that, and I don't think it's something we discussed, but I recognized it in my daughter. I was very anxious and stressed out during the pregnancy with her, and she was born with social anxiety disorder. Her ability to, she would be up late at night, she would cry at every little thing, everything, things that would be normal, like dropping something, she would lose it. Um, she couldn't differentiate between excitement and stress. So everything to her was a panic attack. And that was because in utero, my levels of cortisol were so fired up that during her brain development, it impacted her brain development. So I think that can also be why there's a lot of more kids today with those types of issues, ADD, things like that. Kids that react to certain things not as easily. So for my daughter, everything she experiences can be traumatic because she just has that lower level of ability to deal with it. It's a higher sensitivity to everything. So everything, mountain out of a molehill type of situation. And it's really out of her control. So that's a lovely thing I got to pass on down to her. But again, when you know better, you do better. So hopefully, I always, my sisters had one of my sisters had very calm pregnancies, and her children are so chill. They're amazing. Like, I wish I knew then what I know now, but my kids are still pretty cool. So, not the end of the world. I just created more people who can help other people. That's all.
That's a good way to look at it. And to kind of go into, so one of the traumas I was thinking of has to definitely stems off of anxiety for me. It relates to driving,
Mm.
and I had some, oh my God, so nervous laugh. So my uncle, 2003, he got in a very bad drunk driving accident. He was in the passenger seat. He passed away. He was only 30.
Wow.
And which it's crazy because I'm going to be 28 this year. So I just keep thinking like, wow, I'm getting so close to
Mm.
that age. It's a weird thought. And he was the first family death. I was like 10 or 11 at that time. So it was the first family death I ever had to experience. And of course, it was complete denial at the beginning because I didn't really know I barely knew what death was. I wasn't really, it wasn't one of those talks
Right.
yet. So it just kind of happened because no, it's not like we planned for
No.
this. So I had, so before I actually even acknowledged that he was really gone, um, my family, we were hosting an event, and an example before I get to the driving example, but we had an event where I didn't realize what we were hosting it for, but there was like a bunch of raffle ticket prizes, and I was a kid just up there like pretending to host with them. And I knew and one of the hosts was my uncle, so I thought I'm going, out, like this was a 2 3 hour event, and the whole time I thought my uncle was one of the hosts for it, but the whole event in reality was to raise money for the funeral.
Oh,
So that's when it finally hit me, and that's when the nightmares started. And then not too or no, wait, I was gonna say not too much after, but I wasn't driving when I was 11. So it was obviously a few
the
years
next week,
late. I got behind the
I
wheel.
stole
No,
my
but
brother's car, and it was really traumatic.
um, so when I did start practicing driving a little bit later,
Yeah.
I um I remember one of the first places that I practiced driving was a cemetery,
Mm.
and ironically it was the one he was in.
Oh.
And I that wasn't really in my mind at the time because focusing on trying to learn how to drive.
Hmm.
I had a very strong hallucination where he appeared in front of the car and I swerved. I thought I was going to hit him. Like I thought it was someone, and then I realized I saw him.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, so that definitely has it's really affected my ability to drive.
Wow.
And it's obviously something I still work through to this
Mm.
day and try to cope better with that type of stuff.
Wow.
And then the other experiences that tie in together that I thought about was one was a past boyfriend. It wasn't that long, and another one was just some random person, but it was two incidents where um this affected my romantic life.
Yeah.
It was two people that, long story short, they tried to take advantage,
Hmm.
and it didn't happen, but it was stopped.
Hmm.
But it I know going forward, because one of the situations I was at their house, and that's always
Right.
awkward to try to get out of
Hmm.
because it's not your safe space. The other one was at my place, so it was a little bit. I thought it was going to be a little bit easier trying to separate the problem
Right.
from my home, but yeah, no, I had difficulty with trying, not even not even just with like saying no, but with actually getting trying to get them out. They didn't really see the problem,
Right.
and sorry, and I know going forward in relationships, if even there was something where it was like I don't know how to describe it. Like, I guess if there's something that was going on between me and a partner where I didn't like love that they were doing it, it was I'd kind of be scared to say no
Kind of like
because
a
of
freeze moment.
yeah, because when I did those other times, I had said no and I felt confident saying no, but they didn't like that and it was twisted into a whole other thing. Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Um, yeah. Yeah. Those are it. First of all, it not only do you not trust the person to validate that you're entering into something you don't want to be doing or whatever, you're not being, you're like, sometimes is the situation better if I just go along and, keep my mouth shut. And
yeah,
that's not right either. So,
no,
you just have to, sometimes it's spending time with yourself and getting yourself healed so that you wouldn't choose those relationships because, or get your, I don't want to say get yourself into the situation because we don't ever, purposefully do anything like that. But we do attract, um, I was in some of the unhealthiest relationships of my life after high school because I was out of the house and I was able to leave home and I was able to be free of my abuser and my abuse, reminders. But it had impacted me in such a way that I was choosing relationships that were not worthy of me because I wasn't feeling like I was worthy of anything. Um, so I think there's always a little bit of something in each of us that we can work on and get better at. And if you know that like having a relationship be an issue or having your trust from someone, trust in someone else being an issue, the best place you can start is getting to the point where you trust yourself to make the right decisions and know that when you say yes, no, or go fly a kite, that you know that you will stand on your feet firm, and whether or not someone listens to you, you have the power to make it happen.
yeah. I've been single for quite a few years now, and it was more. I used to always chase love back in the day, and
Ditto.
it was more and now this whole being single now was more of, like you said, just to be able to heal and trust
Yeah.
myself, and because I actually wanted to be single and I felt like I didn't need to be with someone. I want to
I
be with
spent
someone, but
four
I don't
years
need
with
to.
that. I spent 4 years saying, this is my time. This is my time. I had two children to take care of. So, I said, this is my time to be a better mother and get healthy so that my children don't end up in the same situations I was. And
Mhm.
so thankfully, you have that ability to say, I'm going to do me right now. And when you're ready and you're worthy of the right person, that right person is already out there for you. It's just a matter of you being ready for it.
Yeah. I I think we're gonna do another commercial break because heavy information here. I feel like just to give people just a few seconds break. We're going to take a quick commercial break. We will be right back. and welcome back to
Mhm.
Let Me Be Frank. So I think I'm going to skip around a little bit because I really want to get to a couple of the audience questions so that we can answer those specific questions. But there was definitely still one thing I at least want to cover to help people was talking about certain techniques to overcome trauma because I know they're seeking professional help.
Mm-hmm.
And I one of my past therapists that I had, they had recommended eye movement therapy. I don't know if
EMDR, yeah.
you've
Mhm.
heard of that. Yeah, I think it's also called it's like eye
Eye movement rapid desensitization
movement. Yeah,
or
that's
decent,
the word.
yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Desensitive.
I didn't do so well with that one. Um,
No.
you Google
Okay.
EMDR, you can read what the title is. So that's one. It's really hard if you are dissociative and can't remember things or visualize. So one of my responses to trauma was that I can't. It's gotten better, but I couldn't visualize. Like they want you to visualize a situation or a bad memory, and I couldn't even do that. Like so,
Mm,
EMDR was so hard for me. I ended up not being able to do that, but they have this other thing called tapping, and that was something that helped. So you tap pressure points, and you have to do it with someone that's trained because you really should never do that on your own. Um, and it gets you to the point where you're kind of getting into a memory where it's, getting you to that point where you're having an anxious moment. And when you tap, it kind of calms your brain and it it almost takes that memory out of the surface, um, and then makes it not have as much power. So I don't know that, I never studied it, but I have done it and it was very helpful. Another thing that I love, 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 and they're called touch points. And touch points are these little square. My therapist gave them to me. I'm with a trauma therapist. I've been with her since October or September of 2018. Changed my life. I had been in therapy for many, many years, decades. And this woman was the first person to actually help me deal with my trauma. Um, and I also got a trauma coach outside of therapy because I can only see her once a week. And I truly recommend that if you are in trauma therapy, you go twice a week, at least at the beginning, because you can't go from being in a session, having something trigger you, and just going about your life. It can be really debilitating. And it actually was for me. And I had to, in my job, I had to actually take the next day off or work from home. So it was very intense. But
mm,
touch points was something she recommended, and it's touchpointsolutions.com. And my insurance actually paid, I want to say 60 or 80% of it. It was like
oh, nice.
$150 for these things that you wear. You can put them in you're not a girl, but you could put them in the sides of your bra, or wear them on your wrists. They actually have wristbands. I didn't like the wristbands because they look like a big Fitbit and you have to wear two of them. I just, I felt like Wonder Woman, like I could. Um, but what happens is it's kind of similar to tapping. So it pulsates on one side of your body and then the next. So it alternates. And when you're anxious, it actually works for headaches, it works for kids. And it actually can shut down a complete freak out session. It helps when you use them. If you don't use them and you have them, it doesn't do any good with them sitting in your purse, which I can say I haven't used them in a while, but I probably could sometimes. But it sounds like I want them to make them so that they don't have a sound, but it sounds like your phone's vibrating on and off. So it sounds like when you hear when one buzzes and then the other one buzzes, you kind of hear it. But I didn't
Okay.
care because I told my boss I was using them. So if she heard me, I go, it's my touch points. And she would just look at me and then look down at my bra. And I'm like, yep, that's where they are. But you could hold them in your hand too. I just wore them there because I could, I could just not have to worry about it. And for me, the center of my body is where I carry most of my trauma. So that's where I felt that I could wear them. You can put them in your socks, you can put them anywhere, and they are truly amazing. I recommend them highly. So that's something I would definitely recommend. If you don't, even if you don't want to go to therapy, touch points is something you can do, and you don't have to see a therapist. Some people have a really hard time, um, you know, sharing their feelings. And I know some culturally, it can be really hard to admit that you have to talk to somebody about something. And men in particular, it's not a bad thing, but it can be a pride thing that, like, to have to go talk to somebody, admit to some issues can be really demeaning unless you have a supportive spouse or partner that can really just encourage you to do that. So um, talk therapy is great. It's not for everybody. Being someone who studied crisis counseling, I thoroughly believe in, especially trauma counseling. But you have to have a good person. You have to have the right person. You have to make sure they are experienced in trauma. Talk therapy for trauma, cognitive behavioral therapy, not the best. It can help, but you have to be dealing with the trauma too.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I know with my degree, I'm strictly on clinical counseling,
mm,
and something like trauma, yeah, would have to be a specialty that I look more into. Like, obviously, I don't know as much as you on the topic, so it's something like I would recommend you to the client if it was some, yeah, serious
yeah.
trauma things they were going through, because I wouldn't be the best fit.
Well, and
I wouldn't be the most effective.
a trauma coach is a great person to have alongside of a talk therapist. So if you can't find a good trauma therapist, a trauma coach is a great aside, because if something does come up in counseling and maybe the therapist can't identify it, but you could share it with your trauma coach, it is something that could help. It could be a good partnership. My therapist was really happy to know that I had somebody that I was talking to in between our sessions. Not all therapists are going to agree with that. But I happened to have one that was, she loved her. So she loved I call her my life coach, but she's really my trauma coach.
What was that website again?
Touchpointsolutions.com.
Solutions. Okay. I wrote down system. So I want to make sure I got that just in case. Because I
Yeah, and
haven't.
all I had to do was I bought them and then I submitted it through my Blue Cross Blue Shield.
Okay. Yeah,
But
definitely
honestly, if
something.
you're going to spend that much money on therapy anyway, you might as well just get them.
I definitely want to look into them. So thank you for that.
Sure.
And we're gonna wrap this up with a couple audience questions, and then yeah, we'll go on with our days. So Spiffo from Facebook and Tyler from Instagram, they asked a similar question, and that was, what is the worst type of trauma in general? And my first thought with that question was, I feel like everyone has different traumas. So I don't know. I feel like that was hard to be like, oh well, this one's the worst. But I want to know
Mine
your
is the
thoughts.
worst. That's it. Mine is the worst. So whatever
That's
your
a good,
trauma is, it's the worst.
yeah.
Because, and I was saying that kiddingly at first, but it's true. Like and I always was, how, let me just tell you how I really toxified myself. So the reason I'm a non-toxic living expert is because it's not just I work for a company called Pure Haven, and I eliminated toxins from my everyday products, but I had to eliminate toxic thinking. And one of my toxic thoughts was I wasn't raped, so my abuse wasn't as bad as the next person. So yeah, I was molested as a child over and over again, but I wasn't raped. I wasn't penetrated. So to me and my family, I wasn't really abused. You know that
Mm.
when I'm not going to even apologize. So when I first told my mother that this had happened to me, she sat my sister and I down and told us about the time she was raped when she was 16 years old. And that basically told me her rape was more, you know, abusive than what happened to me.
Wow.
And it wasn't her, in her mind, she was not telling me it didn't matter. she didn't know how to process what I had told her. And in her mind, since I hadn't been raped, what she was about to do was okay, which was not keep me from my abuser. She thought, we'll just talk about it, we'll get it out in the open, and it will stop. And unfortunately, it didn't. It stopped for a time. But, you know, and yes, I can thank God I wasn't raped. I can thank God that, but to know that someone thought the way that he thought of me as a 12-year-old child, and then a 14-year-old child, and even to this day, I swear, if I laid eyes on the guy, I would still feel like that. And that doesn't mean my mom's not right, that her abuse was worse than mine. It was her abuse. So for me, my abuse was the worst. There is no trauma that is the worst. A child whose mother is in the home and that child, you know, gets yelled at every day because the mom doesn't know how to deal with stress, doesn't have a great nurturing situation, isn't going to develop properly, and that child's trauma to him is just as bad as mine is to me. It's subjective, and no one should ever belittle someone else's trauma. Now, somebody who lived through Rwanda, I went to Rwanda for a mission trip during my crisis counseling degree. It was my internship. And that left me in a pretty rough spot for 30 days afterwards, because I saw what people endured. And I think it was around the 20-year anniversary of it. And these people were stronger than I was. So to me, still, my trauma was worse. But, you know, it's not. It's just that you can't really rate it that way. Does that make sense?
No, definitely. It does. I To make this a little lighter, when you first when you first said mine, I took that I almost took it as you were saying yours, as in like yours more than everyone else. And I'm like, oh, all right, yeah, Tony's is the worst. Like, I'm not gonna argue this. Like
He's the
she's
expert.
adamant.
He must know.
But no, I think that's a great answer for that, because yeah, I didn't know how to even get to that answer. I just kept thinking that, like, there's just so many different types of traumas
There are, and
out
that's
there.
the thing. It's not if your brain doesn't allow you to process the trauma in a healthy way, then it needs to be dealt with. And it doesn't matter what the trauma is. You can't, you know, like you had, I think one of the questions was, and I'm sorry if I'm skipping ahead, but, you know, why is it that, or how is it that two people who grew up in the same house experience the same, like, say that it's, you know, me and my sister grew up in a house and we're both abused. Why did it affect me in one way and her in another? And I always used to think, well, because I got the worst of it. But it could truly just be that her brain allowed her to process the trauma differently. Um, I always felt like my sister was, you know, she was successful at a young age. She bought a house by the time she was 23, I think. And I still never owned a house in my life. My credit was bad because I was a single mom for 27 years and barely got child support. And, you know, so we had different paths, but it was, maybe it's our strength of character at the time. But I personally feel like she has been stronger up to a point. And for me, I feel like I've got blessings upon blessings that she may never have, because I had the traumatic experience that I had. And I'm able to kind of look at it now and go, okay, that's what that looked like before. And this is where I am now. You know, so really you can't, I don't think I'm sure there's been studies, I'm sure there's papers on it, but I don't think there's a clear indication as to why two people can grow up in the same home and come out completely different. I think it's the same reason why two kids who grow up with a home with loving parents, one can still end up, you know, addicted to opiates or homeless or whatever. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean the bad, just like the good doesn't have the same effects for two different people. It's, we all live life experiences differently. So, I mean, I don't know that there's a real answer. I'm sure there's a paper on it somewhere, but I personally don't think there's a textbook answer for that.
Yeah. We have time for one more question from the audience, and that was Wayne from Facebook. He asked, should I be concerned that I am becoming numb to trauma?
That's a good one. I would like to talk to him actually. I want to know why he feels he's becoming numb to trauma. Is it because he's continually experiencing it? Does he mean numb as in, I think that's kind of a pretty big question. There is a shutdown valve almost in the brain, and you can become numb, and it's dissociation. But I don't want to diagnose a dissociation over, a question. But
Yeah.
I, it's kind of like you get to the point where, it's kind of like when you're a doctor and people, say you're a surgeon and you lose a patient, the first one is really, really bad. You take it really hard, but then you realize, what, this is kind of what I do. And, you can't, some people just, you might lose somebody. And so then they lose the next one and it's a little bit different. And the next one is a little bit different. And, then it becomes a thing where it's not that it will never bother you, but you just become immune to it in a way. But that doesn't necessarily mean there won't be future repercussions. So I would say Wayne needs to, it would be a good suggestion to determine, is he experiencing continued trauma and be re-traumatized? Being re-traumatized can be a big issue. So there's definitely a lot more questions I'd ask based on that question.
After we record this, I'll see if there's, if they're willing to
Yeah, I mean, they
connect
don't have to talk about it. It's,
or not. Yeah.
yeah, it's just, that's a hard question to answer without other information. I wouldn't be responsible. Um, I wouldn't be acting responsibly if I tried to answer that
Yeah.
without information. And who asked the question about the living in the same house? I don't want to not give them a shout out.
That was just something, that was just one of the ones I came up with.
Okay.
But yeah, that's today's episode. And Toni, I want to thank you so much for being a guest.
Anytime. This is my, literally, I lived it so that I could um, change other people's perceptions on it, and, not just make people aware that it's a real thing, but validate those who maybe need some validation to know that, what, I'm not crazy. That, I used to think, oh, it didn't really happen, or it wasn't as bad, and then for a long time I thought, maybe it didn't really happen. Am I that crazy? And, you have to be able to take your control of your life to the point that you don't let others dictate what you're okay with. If it doesn't feel okay, then it's not okay.
I agree.
So thanks
And
for having me.
oh, of course. I was like, maybe some future episodes we can. There's tons of topics in the world.
Totally. We'll be
I
talking about COVID and parents who had to teach their children for the next 6 months.
oh,
That's a
I
whole
know. I was gonna say, yeah, that could definitely be. We could have a whole book club.
yeah.
I also want to thank today's sponsor for sponsoring this episode. I want to thank Sakura HZ, who makes the intro music for the episodes, and Tokyo Music Walker makes the beautiful outro for Let Me Be Frank episodes. And lastly, I want to thank each and every one of you for listening. I know because Tony just reminded me of when the first episode came out. I Someone had messaged me about how they'd learned something new, or they, like it actually there was things they got from it. And I with all these episodes going forward, I'm just happy if at least one person gets something
Mm,
out of these.
definitely.
But all right, so thank you guys so much, and I hope everyone has a great day.